Welcome to the online lecture for the tree biology topic, energy balance of leaves and forests. This lecture will be offered in two parts, and this is the first part, part A, which focuses on inputs and outputs and some of the basic principles of energy balance. The objectives of this lecture are first to understand how energy input and dissipation or output occurs. That's the first part of the lecture. And in the second part of the lecture, we'll understand how morphological and physiological characteristics modify energy balance. So it's an interesting fact that without energy output or dissipation, without any way of getting rid of the energy that leaves absorb, in full sunlight, a leaf could reach 100 degrees Celsius within a few minutes. That's pretty hot. Now, we don't see leaves boiling or steaming normally in the forest, so that tells us that leaves have mechanisms for dissipating excess energy. So we'll learn about how leaves take in and dissipate radiant energy, and we'll use the energy balance concept to understand that. The energy balance concept is based on the law of conservation of energy, and what that means is that energy is neither created or destroyed. So energy that comes in someplace has to go someplace or be stored. So energy input, in this case energy into a leaf, has to equal the energy output plus the energy stored. Now when we think about energy stored, when we think about an object like a leaf or a stem or another part of a forest, stored energy basically means a change in temperature. So if energy is stored in a leaf, that means the temperature goes up. If energy is released from storage in a leaf, that means energy goes down. So that's an important principle, that the temperature of a leaf is a function of the balance between energy inputs and energy outputs. So that's a really important principle for this lecture. So the main points of this lecture are where does the energy come from, what are the inputs, and what tree and leaf characteristics affect that input, and then how is energy dissipated or output, and what characteristics affect that output. So we can think about a situation where there's a relatively large energy input and a relatively small energy output, which results in a relatively large amount of stored energy, and that means the leaf temperature goes up, versus a situation where you have the same amount of energy input but a larger amount of energy output and a smaller amount of energy stored. So the leaf temperature does not rise as much or maybe stays the same. So again, we're focusing on how these energy input and output characteristics influence the energy balance and therefore the temperature of leaves and other plant parts. The starting point for talking about energy balance are the energy inputs. And when we talk about energy input from an energy balance standpoint, we're talking about solar radiation, radiation from the sun. And this graph shows relative solar radiation received at the Earth's surface and also received above the atmosphere across a range of wavelengths. So just as a review, visible wavelengths are approximately from 400 to 700. Those are the wavelengths we can see. Shorter wavelengths move into the ultraviolet. Most ultraviolet radiation is absorbed by the ozone layer, but we do receive a little bit of ultraviolet radiation at the Earth's surface. The wavelengths longer than visible are infrared wavelengths. This is the far red, this is infrared wavelengths. So the first category of incoming solar radiation is shortwave solar radiation. This is radiation in the visible and shorter wavelengths received directly from the sun. The amount of shortwave solar radiation absorbed by a leaf is determined by the absorption coefficient. And the absorption coefficient is just a number from 0 to 1 that indicates what fraction of incoming shortwave radiation is absorbed by that surface. Conifer needles, like pines or spruces, tend to have a very high shortwave solar radiation coefficient in the neighborhood of 0.9. So they absorb about 90% of the shortwave radiation incident on them. Whereas broadleaves, things like oaks, maple, tend to have lower absorption coefficients, somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.5. The reflection coefficient is just 1 minus the absorption coefficient. So the radiation that's not absorbed by the leaf is reflected. So the reflection coefficient for conifer leaves, which have an absorption coefficient of 0.9, have a reflection coefficient of 1 minus 0.9 or 0.1, meaning 10% of the incoming shortwave solar radiation is reflected. The next category of solar radiation is shortwave sky and cloud, or diffuse radiation. This is radiation coming from directions other than direct radiation from the disk of the sun. So when you look up into the sky and see light reflecting from the clouds or scattered in the sky, coming from all sorts of different directions, that's shortwave radiation, which is also, or shortwave sky and cloud radiation, which is also referred to as diffuse radiation. Scattered radiation refers to radiation that interacts with particles and changes direction. A special type of scattering is Rayleigh scattering. Rayleigh scattering is the scattering of radiation caused by interaction with very small particles in the atmosphere, molecule-sized particles. Now those sized particles tend to interact preferentially with shorter wavelengths. So when we think about visible radiation, the shorter wavelengths tend towards blue. So the blue color of the sky is caused by Rayleigh scattering, the interaction of short wavelengths of light with molecule-sized particles in the atmosphere, and that causes a blue scattering or coloring of the sky. Long-wave radiation is infrared radiation, radiation in wavelengths longer than the visible spectrum. An important thing to understand about long-wave radiation is any object above absolute zero or 0 degrees Kelvin emits long-wave radiation. So most long-wave radiation from the sky is due to radiation coming from carbon dioxide and water vapor particles in the atmosphere that have absorbed radiation and heated up and then emitted long-wave radiation. The amount of long-wave radiation, which is symbolized by the big E here, the amount of long-wave radiation emitted by an object is described by the Stefan-Boltzmann law. So this is the equation that describes the Stefan-Boltzmann law. So the Stefan-Boltzmann law says the amount of long-wave radiation emitted by an object is a function of the temperature of that object in Kelvin raised to the fourth power, along with the emissivity and the Stefan-Boltzmann constant. Okay. The Stefan-Boltzmann constant is a constant discovered by these two guys, Stefan and Boltzmann. The temperature is self-explanatory, but note that temperature is raised to the fourth power. That means if the temperature of an object goes up a little bit, the amount of long-wave radiation that it emits goes up a lot. This final number, the emissivity, is a property of the object. So the emissivity of an object basically determines how efficiently that object absorbs and emits long-wave radiation. Emissivity is a number ranging from 0 to 1, and an object with an emissivity of 1 is termed a black body. Conifer leaves, or actually most leaves, behave almost like black bodies. They have emissivities in the upper 90s, 0.95 to 0.99. So leaves behave almost like black bodies. They strongly absorb infrared radiation and strongly emit infrared radiation. Okay, so those were the energy inputs. Let's talk about how energy can be dissipated from leaves and other objects. I'm going to divide it up into three different categories. Those categories, those components that are minor, they're not terribly important for energy dissipation, intermediately important components, and then major components. So the minor components are assimilation, which is basically photosynthesis, respiration, mitochondrial respiration, conduction, and transmission. Assimilation and respiration basically just mean when radiation, light, is absorbed by leaves, some of that energy is dissipated by photosynthesis. Photosynthesis fixes sugars and stores some energy in the chemical bonds of sugars, and then some of that energy is released through respiration. These two components obviously are very important for the plant from a growth perspective, but they're not very important in terms of determining the energy balance and the temperature of the leaf. Assimilation and respiration together probably dissipate maybe 1% of the total radiation absorbed by the leaf. Conduction just refers to energy that is dissipated by heat moving from molecule to molecule and then leaving the leaf, for instance, through the petiole. That's loss of heat by conduction. That's also very small. And then transmission refers to radiation that strikes the surface of the leaf, passes through the leaf, and then out of the bottom of the leaf. Transmission obviously will vary depending on how thick the leaf is, but in general, it's a pretty small component. Two intermediate components are reflected radiation and long-wave radiation, or re-radiation. Reflected radiation just refers to, as we've mentioned, short-wave radiation that strikes the surface of the leaf and is reflected away. Long-wave radiation, also called re-radiation, refers to energy that is emitted from a leaf due to its temperature. So some energy is lost from a leaf just due to the loss of long-wave radiation from the leaf because it has a temperature above absolute zero. There are two major components for energy dissipation. The first is convection. Convection refers to the loss of temperature from a leaf due to the transfer of energy from the leaf to the surrounding air. So heat is transferred from the leaf to air molecules around the leaf, and those air molecules then move away from the leaf and transfer energy away from the leaf. convection can be modified in a couple of ways. In terms of temperature difference, the bigger the temperature difference between the leaf and the air, the higher the rate of convection. Convection is also influenced by boundary layers. Now, we talked about boundary layer resistance when we talked about controls over leaf resistance or water loss. And if you recall, I mentioned that boundary layer resistance, while it's not usually important for controlling water loss from leaves, is actually pretty important for controlling convection from leaves. You can almost think about the boundary layer, this layer of still air along the surface of a leaf, as a blanket that insulates that leaf from the loss, convective loss of energy to the air around it. In this case, the boundary layer resistance is indicated by this resistance term, resistance to loss of heat from the leaf. As you recall, boundary layer resistance is determined by two physical properties: the size of the leaf. Bigger leaves have higher boundary layer resistance, and wind speed. The higher the wind speed, the lower the boundary layer resistance. The other major component for energy dissipation is latent heat loss. Latent heat loss just refers to heat that is lost through the evaporation of water. So this is transpiration. So when water evaporates from a leaf, quite a bit of energy is expended or lost or dissipated because it takes a lot of energy to evaporate water. The amount of energy that it takes to evaporate water is referred to as the latent heat of evaporation of water. And water has among the highest latent heats of evaporation of all molecules. So the two major components for energy loss are convective heat loss and latent heat loss or transpiration. So we can summarize the inputs and outputs of energy to a leaf with this diagram. So this is a schematic of a leaf, and we can look at the energy inputs. Here we have long wave radiation in. So long wave radiation is radiation emitted by objects in the atmosphere or other leaves above the leaf, and that can come from two directions because there are objects below the leaf as well. Short wave radiation can come in from the sky or from the sun, but can also come from the bottom of the leaf through reflection from surfaces below the leaf. So those are the two primary means of energy input. Energy output, here's assimilation, and in this case metabolism, which we referred to as respiration. We can have loss of energy through long wave radiation emission from the top or bottom of the leaf. We can have loss of radiation through transmission. And we can have loss of radiation through convection or through latent heat loss. You notice that the latent or evaporative heat loss is indicated as being larger on the lower surface of the leaf because that's where most of the stomata are on most leaves.